Hey there, I'm Todd on High, and today I'm revisiting a build for the Division 2. You may recall my Creeping Trauma video because, somehow, a lot of you seem to have watched it. Well, today it's getting an upgrade. Creeping Trauma V2 still relies on Trauma and Creeping Death, but it ditches the exotic holster in favor of a 4-piece Eclipse Protocol set. This build remains tons of fun for farming on challenging difficulty and general group PvE play. I'm gonna skip the usual disclaimers this time, you guys know the drill, so let's just get to it. Again, the two main goals of this CC DPS Hybrid are crowd control and killing enemies quickly. If you saw my original Creeping Trauma video and went out and found a decent Pestilence, Trauma Chest, and Creeping Death backpack, well, you're about halfway to V2 already. Frankly, all I did to make this build was take 4 pieces of Eclipse Protocol and roll skill tier off of them. And I didn't even care how bad the secondary rolls were. I wound up with a 4-2-0 build to start off, as far as core attributes, which was a good mix. After some experimenting, I found there's some flexibility here if you'd rather go 5-1-0, 5-0-1, 4-1-1, or even 4-0-2, but any fewer than 4 reds and your gun damage will start to be noticeably inadequate. With 4 or more red cores, you'll actually be able to kill things, and so long as you're hitting headshots and things are dying, you will be CCing entire rooms of enemies. A Golan Gear backpack and a Petrov chest would be ideal, but neither brand is required by any means. Normally I don't like being too specific with the pieces of these builds. Some of that attitude just comes from this game having RNG-based drops because I don't want to recommend you need something if you're going to grind days for it. I know I'm not starting a trend here, and I don't want this to feel like I love gear sets now, especially after my shield and shotgun build, which is still tons of fun in Title Update 10 by the way, but the Eclipse Protocol set is really useful, and when combined with these two talents and the Pestilence, it's pretty incredible. I'm not trying to bash skill-based crowd control, but as I've said before, this is still a shooting game. The way Creeping Death spreads your blind and bleed effects from trauma, which then Eclipse Protocol spreads further, is all happening while you're shooting. The damage doesn't have to pause so you can aim your skill, and the cooldowns on Trauma and Creeping Death are both mercifully short, especially compared to certain skills now. That, in addition to whatever crowd control skill or skills you decide to bring, will constantly be halting enemies and leaving them vulnerable. Originally, I had planned to use the Imperial Dynasty with this setup and switch out the backpack, as the Protocol backpack adds a similar buff as the Wicked talent, except that it's always on. But with the recent buff to Creeping Death now spreading full strength copies of your status effects, it's difficult to give that up. Possibly something to keep in mind for different kinds of fights, especially to try out the new Vial Mask whenever I see one drop, but the combo of Trauma and Creeping Death only gets better when you add Eclipse Protocol 2 and 4-piece bonuses on top of it. To try to mix things up and get out of my comfort zone, I chose to use the Riot Foam Chem Launcher with this build initially. It's possible to immobilize entire waves with a single foam round, leading to faster, easier room clears. The downside is, of course, with a low skill tier, you won't have a ton of ammo for the chem launcher, although it does have a very short cooldown, especially with a few skill haste mods on your gear. The shock trap was also fun to play with, though its mediocre throw range does require a more dangerous, closer up style of play, not to mention it is just useless in certain rooms. These aren't the only ways to control crowds, as several skills apply status effects, especially if you don't mind playing with fire, so find what works best for you. A healing skill like the Repair Drone or Mender Seeker is optional, but just as before, I recommend you stick with Survivalist to bring on the damage buff to status affected enemies, as well as fire grenades. The Pestilence remains a fantastic primary weapon for this build. Although your status effect stat does not buff the Pestilence poison, the high rate of fire and magazine size are both beastly alongside the damage over time effect it adds. The way the poison spreads fits right in with the rest of this setup, and with the title update 10 fixed to allow stacking poison even on robots, turrets, and drones, the Pestilence destroys everything from trash ninjas to Black Tusk heavies. The only real downside is its ungodly long reload time, which can be tough to get used to. For a secondary weapon, the Pyromaniac is still a great choice, but any assault rifle with eyeless would be just as useful. Speaking of eyeless, it's worth mentioning that this build is far less effective if you're not able to actually land headshots. If you're not proccing the blind effect multiple times in each room, you may need to adjust your aim. While the bleed from trauma is useful, it does not stun enemies the same way other effects do. Blind and immobilize will both pop enemies out of cover, which obviously makes them easier to shoot, in addition to them standing still, being marked, and having increased damage taken. I know a lot of people use fire with Eclipse Protocol, and there's nothing wrong with that. Fire and shock are far from useless, but they don't make mobs as vulnerable because they're often in cover or kneeling, respectively. Your first job is crowd control. Your second job is to kill things fast, so use whatever will help you do the second while the first is going on. Without some luck on your rolls, you may not be able to stack huge amounts of crit, but stacking headshot damage will reward you if your aim is true. So there you go, an update to my most popular build. If you have any questions about this setup or spot any major errors, let me know, and definitely circle back with a comment if you try this out. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoy this sort of content, please make sure to drop a like and subscribe. Good luck out there, agents, and happy farming!